Hello, everyone. Today we are in chapter 7 of John's Gospel. And there is so much going on in this chapter. I can only hope to scrape the surface. But hopefully I can point out some things that might give you some aha moments. The very beginning, we see Jesus is in Galilee. He's teaching and preaching and doing his thing. And at verse 2, we read this. But soon it was time for the Jewish festival of shelters. And Jesus' brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, where your followers can see your miracles." So two things. First, what is the Festival of Shelters? Depending upon your translation, it may say the Festival of Tabernacles or the Festival of Booths. They're all the same thing. It was a week-long festival that happened in late October, early November, and it was a celebration remembering the 40 years in the desert. So what the Jews would do is they would actually go on a great big camping trip. They would build shelters really quickly, like put palm fronds as roofs, and essentially it was a first century tent that they were building. And they would either go out into an open space and build up a great big campsite, or in the case of Jerusalem, they would frequently just do it right out in front of their houses or on top of their roofs. And they would set up and essentially camp out for a week with each other, remembering what it was like to have been the Israelites for the 40 years that they wandered the desert. So that's the occasion. Everybody's gathering in Jerusalem for that. And Jesus' brothers, who, by the way, don't believe in him, they're his half biological brothers, they're not convinced of him at all. And they're kind of egging him on, like, hey, why don't you go to Jerusalem? I mean, that's where the crowds are. If you want to get your name known, take advice from us, buddy. We're here to help you. Jesus says, my time has not yet come. And you might remember, he said something exactly like that in chapter 2, when his mother said, hey, they've run out of wine. Can you do something about it? He said, my time has not yet come. In both cases, he still did something. He made wine in chapter 2, and as it turns out, as you read on, you'll see that he does actually go to Jerusalem, which brings us to a climax scene at verse 37. On the last day, the climax of the festival, Jesus stood and shouted to the crowd, "Anyone who is thirsty may come to me. Anyone who believes in me may come and drink, for the scripture declares, rivers of living water will flow from his heart." The significance of this scene is that on the climax of the festival, they would pick a chief priest who would go on a procession down to the river to get a great big flask of water, and then he would carry that back up and pour it out on the altar. And it was a remembrance of how God provided water to the Israelites in the desert. Jesus is interrupting that scene by saying that if you're thirsty, I am the living water that will satisfy you for real. It's a really powerful scene that ultimately ends up dividing the crowd as they think to themselves, wow, this guy is declaring himself the Messiah, and maybe he is. Here's what we see next happening at verse 40. When the crowd heard him say this, some of them declared, surely this man is a prophet, or is the prophet we've been expecting. Others said, he is the Messiah. Still others said, but he can't. Will the Messiah come from Galilee? For the scripture clearly states that the Messiah will be born of the royal line of David in Bethlehem, the village where King David was born. It goes on to say that the crowd was divided about this, and it raises for me kind of the issue that I want to walk away with today as I study the scripture, my kind of takeaway point. You see, we know, having read Matthew and Luke, that indeed Jesus is from David's line, and he was born in Bethlehem, just as the scripture says he was going to be. But the crowd doesn't know that. All the crowd knows is that Jesus had come there from Galilee, and so they make an assumption about Jesus. These are people who know their scripture, and especially when you get to the part at the end of the chapter where the Pharisees are jumping in on this argument too. They know their Bibles really, really well, but they are making the assumption that they know what God is doing right now without asking the obvious question. The obvious question is just to go to Jesus and say, hey, wait a second, where are you from? And Jesus would have told them. But they think they know Jesus better than they really do. We are often guilty of the same thing. And let's just be honest about that. We have a good grip of how the world is supposed to work, and we've read our Bibles and have a sense of it, but God is at work around us all the time. And sometimes we make assumptions about what we think God is doing or what we think God ought to be doing without asking question. That's what prayer is all about. When we see the world doing what the world does, we got to believe that God is in control. God has a plan, and we may even have a place in that plan. We just got to ask God where He's calling us to be and what He's calling us to do, and trust in Him. At the end of the chapter, we're going to be reintroduced to the man Nicodemus who went to visit with Jesus late one night in chapter 3. And Nicodemus is still on the fence, it would seem, but at least he's smart enough to say, wait a minute, shouldn't we be asking some questions? And the fact that he even suggests that there are questions to be asked, the Pharisees shut him down by saying, what, are you a Galilean too? So I guess the point being is that when we see ourselves or the people around us getting narrow-minded and making assumptions, we need to slam on the brakes and not be afraid to ask God, because He will answer. If these devotional videos are helpful to you, subscribe to our channel and click the notification button so you know when we post a new video. And of course, please share them with others.